The moment she told me she was pregnant, I didn't feel shock, I didn't feel joy, and I didn't even feel anger, because deep down, before the words had even fully left her mouth, I already knew something she thought she was about to reveal as a surprise. Something she believed would control the direction of the conversation, something she expected would shift power in her favor, but instead it confirmed something I had been quietly preparing for long before she ever packed her bags for that trip she called necessary space. A phrase that sounded harmless on the surface but carried a weight that most people choose to ignore until it's too late. Except I didn't ignore it. I watched it, I studied it, and I let it unfold without interruption, because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be forced into the open. Sometimes it reveals itself more clearly when you give it enough time and space to become undeniable, and as she stood there waiting for a reaction, expecting me to step into the role she had already written for me, I simply looked at her, not confused, not emotional, but calm in a way that immediately disrupted her expectations, because when someone is prepared for chaos and receives silence instead, it creates a kind of tension they don't know how to handle, and that tension was exactly where I needed her to be. She had just returned from that trip only a few days earlier, moving through the house like nothing had changed, like the distance between us hadn't been growing for months in ways that were subtle enough to deny, but obvious enough to feel, because the truth is, relationships rarely break all at once. They fracture slowly, quietly, through small shifts in behavior that most people dismiss as temporary or harmless. But those small shifts add up. They form patterns, and patterns, when observed long enough, start telling a story that words alone can't hide. And I had been paying attention to those patterns for longer than she realized, noticing the way her phone became something she guarded more carefully than before, the way conversations became shorter, less engaged, more distant, as if she was already emotionally investing somewhere else, while still physically present, and I didn't confront her, not because I was unaware, but because I understood something most people don't, that confronting someone too early only teaches them how to hide better. And I wasn't interested in partial truths or temporary confessions. I was interested in clarity, in certainty, in something that couldn't be reshaped or explained away when the moment finally came, and that's why I waited. The decision to wait wasn't easy, because waiting requires control. It requires resisting the instinct to react, to demand answers, to force honesty out of a situation that isn't ready to give it yet. But I had already reached a point where emotions were less useful than information, and information, when gathered correctly, has a way of revealing everything without needing to ask a single question. So instead of confronting her, I shifted my focus entirely, observing without interfering, documenting without reacting, allowing her to move freely within a space where she believed she wasn't being watched. Because that's when people are the most honest, when they think they're unobserved. And over time, what started as small inconsistencies began to form a clearer picture, one that wasn't built on assumptions or suspicion, but on repetition, on behavior that aligned too consistently to be accidental. And by the time she mentioned the trip, by the time she framed it as something she needed for herself, I already understood that it wasn't about space, it was about continuation, about extending something that had already begun long before that moment. And that's when I made a decision that most people wouldn't, a decision that would ensure that when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't be something I had to question. It would be something I already understood completely. I didn't hire someone immediately because rushing into action would have been driven by emotion and emotion clouds, judgment in ways that make people careless. But once the patterns became too consistent to ignore, once the behavior aligned in a way that suggested intention rather than coincidence, I chose to remove myself from the equation entirely, to rely on something objective, something that didn't feel, didn't assume, didn't interpret, but simply recorded, because the truth, when documented properly, doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself in ways that words never can. And the reports that came in weren't dramatic. At first they didn't show anything that could be used immediately as proof, but they didn't need to, because they showed consistency, and consistency over time becomes evidence, small details connecting to form something larger, something undeniable. And as the days passed, as the information accumulated, it became clear that this wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment, it wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern that had been maintained carefully, intentionally, and by the time she left for that trip, by the time she framed it as something innocent, I already knew that what she was really doing wasn't stepping away from our life, it was stepping deeper into another one. So when she stood there in front of me telling me she was pregnant, watching my face carefully, measuring my reaction, waiting for the moment where everything would shift in her favor, she had no idea that, for me, that shift had already happened long ago, that the moment she thought she controlled was actually the final piece of a process I had been managing silently for months. And instead of reacting the way she expected, instead of asking questions that would give her room to respond, to explain, to manipulate the narrative, I simply turned away from her and walked toward the table, slow, deliberate, controlled, because movement, when done without urgency, communicates something powerful. It signals certainty, and certainty in a moment like that is far more unsettling than anger. And as I reached the table, I picked up the envelope that had been sitting there untouched, waiting, not because I had just prepared it, but because I had prepared it long before this moment ever arrived, and when I placed it in her hands without saying a word, I could see it immediately. The shift in her expression, the moment where confidence gave way to uncertainty, because whatever she expected this moment to be, it wasn't this. She looked at the envelope for a moment before opening it, her expression shifting from confusion to curiosity, and then to something more subtle, something closer to unease. Because there's a certain kind of tension that builds when someone realizes they're no longer in control of a situation they thought they understood, and as she slowly broke the seal, as her fingers hesitated just enough to reveal that something inside her had already begun to question what was happening, I remained completely still, not watching her directly, but aware of every movement, every reaction, because this wasn't about confrontation, it was about revelation. About allowing her to see something she hadn't prepared, for something that couldn't be explained away with words, and as she pulled out the contents, as her eyes moved across the pages, across the images, across the carefully organized timeline of events that documented not just what had happened, but how long it had been happening, the change in her expression wasn't immediate. It didn't happen all at once, but it was undeniable, a gradual shift from confidence to realization, from control to exposure. The photos alone would have been enough for most people. The clear, undeniable evidence of moments she thought were private moments she believed existed outside the reach of consequence. But what truly broke the illusion wasn't just the images, it was the structure, the way everything was laid out. Dates aligned with locations, messages connected to actions, patterns displayed in a way that made it impossible to deny intent, because isolated incidents can be explained, they can be reframed, they can be minimized, but patterns, when presented clearly, remove that possibility entirely. And, as she continued to go through the contents, as her breathing shifted almost imperceptibly, as her posture changed in a way that revealed the weight of what she was seeing, I finally spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, but calmly, because calm in a moment like that reinforces control in a way that no amount of anger ever could. And when I told her that this wasn't about catching her, that this wasn't about proving something I had just discovered, but about confirming something I had already known, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the realization that the story she thought she was telling me had already been written long before she ever spoke. But the envelope wasn't finished, and that was the part she didn't expect, because as overwhelming as the evidence was, as undeniable as the truth had become in that moment, it wasn't the most important thing inside, and when she reached the final document, the one that had been placed beneath everything else folded, in a way that made it easy to miss if she had chosen to stop earlier, everything changed again, because this wasn't about what she had done. It was about what had already been set into motion as a result, and as she unfolded it, as her eyes scanned the page and then returned to the beginning, as if to confirm what she was seeing, the reaction this time was immediate, sharper, more visceral, because, unlike the evidence which explained the past, this document defined the future, a future she was no longer in control of. And when she looked up at me when she tried to speak, but couldn't quite form the words, I understood something clearly in that moment. That the power she thought she had walked into this conversation with had never actually been hers. The divorce papers were already signed, already filed, already processed in a way that made them irreversible, not because I wanted to rush the outcome, but because I wanted to remove the possibility of negotiation, of emotional appeals, of last-minute attempts to reshape the narrative into something more favorable, because once people realize they've lost control, their first instinct is to try to regain it. and I had no interest in giving her that opportunity, and as she stood there holding the document that represented not just the end of our marriage, but the consequences of every decision she had made leading up to this moment, the silence between us changed again. It was no longer tense. No longer uncertain, it was final, because there was nothing left to discuss, nothing left to argue, nothing left to decide. Everything that needed to happen had already happened, and for the first time since she walked into that room, she wasn't the one holding the future. As I walked away, leaving her standing there with the envelope still in her hands, the weight of everything settling in around her, I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel satisfaction. Because this was never about winning. It was about clarity, about understanding something fully before acting on it. And as the door closed behind me, one thought stayed with me, clear and unshakable. She thought she was bringing me news that would change my life. But the truth was, I had already changed it long before she ever spoke.